Hi, this is Paul. Benjamin Boyce tweeted a very interesting article this morning by Mary Harrington. The sexual revolution killed feminism. Fetishizing freedom harms us all. It's often noted that the right generally has a better grasp on the left's motives and arguments than vice versa. The right thinks the left is mistaken, while the left thinks the right is evil. There's one exception: feminism. I have sympathy for some critiques advanced by friends on the right on the excesses and unaccounted costs of feminism. I've made a number of those critiques myself, but I'm often frustrated by the conservatives' refusal to engage with feminist arguments or history much beyond the pop versions you might find on the pages of Vox. The result is regrettably a right-wing treatment of the women's movement that is often as ignorant of what it decries as modern liberal feminists are of conservative case against abortion. We can do better, and we must, because today defending women's interests is properly and rightly a defense of the family, which is to say of all humans, including men, understood as relational beings. Now, this issue of relational beings I'm going to want to touch on in not only this piece, but a couple of more things that I want to pull into this video today. It isn't easy to see from a conservative vantage point that blames feminism for many modern social ills. Some of this critique is not without justice, nor is the women's movement without justice. I don't believe in progress in the arc of history sense, nor do I believe that there exists an eternal conspiracy against women called patriarchy. Worked free of these fairy tales, what we think of today as feminism is a story of economic transitions. Specifically, it's a story of how men and women renegotiated life in common, in response first to the transition in the industrial era and into the 20th century market society. If everyone today seems to be arguing about men and women again, it's because we're in the throes of another economic transition. To illustrate, I'll take a short detour through that story. Of course, this is complex and varied by factors such as class, race, and geography. But since what we think of as feminism today is mainly driven by bourgeois white American women and serves their class interests, I'll focus on their story. In the beginning of the 19th century, America was mostly agrarian, and typical American matron was a disciplined, skilled, devout individual who worked alongside her husband in a productive household. She processed raw materials and foodstuffs produced by male family members into meals, clothing, and so on, usually while caring for multiple children. The patriarchal legal system of coverture, which subsumed her legal personhood and property into that of her husband, rendered her technically a subordinate class of citizen. It also served a shield from market pressures. This is obviously a very simplified summary, but let's keep reading. By the end of the 19th century, though, America was more industrial than agrarian. Families were smaller. Work took place outside the home, forcing a much sharper split between sex roles. In the new private household, the bourgeois woman was more economically dependent than her agrarian grandmother. Her main activities were education of children, the management of servants, and the consumption of goods produced elsewhere. She may have been more materially comfortable, but this woman had, in many respects, less agency than her foremothers. One of the podcasts that was on The Rest is History, because I listened to most of them, that I found quite good recently was the one on the Industrial Revolution with Emma Griffin. It was very much worthwhile listening to, and will probably come into more of my videos as we go on. This prompted a frenzy of debate about sex roles. Some women moralized the new feminine role. They framed the house as a sanctuary from competitive life in America's capitalist economy. Now, you can't help but see elements of the Protestant Reformation in here, too. The Protestant Reformation was very much an urban movement, and so the house sort of displacing the monastery as little church. Her task was to tend the sanctuary and to shape the children whose ability to flourish in industrial society depended on having the right moral and intellectual education. This was the so-called cult of domesticity. But it takes a while for social norms to catch up with changing material conditions. The old legal system of coverture still existed. Women had lost their agency in the agrarian productive household and as yet acquired no other kind. The result was an economic and political helplessness that resulted in some deep injustices. It was this imbalance that drove the first feminist campaigns for property ownership and enfranchisement. Fast forward a century, labor-saving devices and booming consumerism have shifted society once again. This set off another round of renegotiating between the sexes as to proper division of roles. Phyllis Schlafly observed the women were liberated more by the washing machine than feminism. And for bourgeois 20th century housewives, labor-saving devices combined with an increasing atomized, individualistic social world to trigger a renewed search for agency, this time within the workplace. I take this detour into women's history to illustrate a core underlying argument. In each case, sex roles has been renegotiated not by some abstract process of moral advancement, but in response to changing material conditions. And in each case, this has been necessary because social and legal norms change more slowly. So what about the central event of the 20th century feminism, the sexual revolution? I come to this separately because, in my view, the sexual revolution was not the start, but the end of feminism. That's a rather interesting idea. In the 19th and early 20th century incarnations, the women's movement sought a positive negotiation of sex roles for prevailing material conditions, in the interest of life in common. But feminism, in this sense, ended in the 1960s. It was killed by the twin technology shocks of contraception and abortion. Up till this point, the women's movement encompassed both women who understood personhood in the context of family life, women as relational beings, and those who argued for women to be treated primarily as individuals, irrespective of the givens of sex or relational obligations. Medical control of fertilization contributed to fundamental material change to this debate. It enabled the final victory of the individualist side. Now, again, an article like this, it's fairly unidimensional. It's focusing mostly on material change. Of course, there are lots of other kinds of changes that were going on in the society as well, but to lose track of any of the layers of change is to diminish the picture involved. It's helpful to note that, well, let me pull this up. A few interesting comments from Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens. Life in the bosom of family and community was far from ideal. Families and communities could oppress their members no less brutally than do modern states and markets, and their internal dynamics were often fraught with tension and violence, yet people had little choice. It's interesting in that episode on The Rest is History, talking about urbanization and why people fled the farms into factories, even though we now look back on factory conditions as quite brutal. In many cases, it was better for them than the life on the farm for many of them. A person who lost her family and community around 1750 was as good as dead. She had no job, no education, no support in times of sickness and distress. Nobody could loan her money or defend her if she got into trouble. There were no policemen, no social workers, and no compulsory education. In order to survive, such a person quickly would find an alternative family or community. Boys and girls who ran away from home could expect, at best, to become servants in some new family. At worst, there was the army and or the brothel. Now, it's helpful to remember, again, part of what we keep an eye on is monastic life. Monasteries, for a long time, also suffered as places where foundlings could be taken in, even foundlings who could walk in by themselves. All this changed dramatically over the last 2 centuries. The Industrial Revolution gave the market immense new powers, provided the state with new means of communication and transportation, and placed at the government's disposal an army of clerks, teachers, policemen, and social workers. At first, the market and the state discovered their path blocked by traditional families and communities, who had little love for outside intervention. Parents and community elders were reluctant to let the younger generation be indoctrinated by nationalist education systems, conscripts into armies, or turned into rootless urban proletariat. Over time, states and markets used their growing power to weaken the traditional bonds of family and community. The state sent its policemen to stop family vendettas and to replace them with court decisions. The market sent its hawkers to wipe out long-standing local traditions and replace them with ever-changing commercial fashions. Yet this was not enough. In order to really break the power of family and community, they needed help from a fifth column. The state and market approached people with an offer that could not be refused. Become individuals, they said. Marry whomever you desire without asking permission from your parents. Take up whatever job suits you, even if community elders frown. Live wherever you wish, even if you cannot make it every week to the family dinner. You are no longer dependent on your family or your community. We, the state and the market, will care for you instead. We will provide food, shelter, education, health, welfare, and employment. We will provide pensions, insurance, and protection. Romantic literature often presents the individual as somebody caught in a struggle against the state and the market. Nothing could be further from the truth. The state and the market are the mother and father of the individual, and the individual can survive only thanks to them. The market provides us with work, insurance, and pension. If we want to study a profession, the government schools are there to teach us. If we want to open a business, a bank loans us money. If we want to buy a house, a construction company builds it, and the bank gives us the mortgage. In some cases, subsidizes or insured by the state. If violence flares up, the police protect us. If we are sick for a few days, our health insurance cares for us. If we are debilitated for months, National Social Services step in. If we need around-the-clock assistance, we can go to the market and hire a nurse, usually some stranger from the other side of the world who takes care of us with the kind of devotion that we no longer expect from our own children. If we have the means, we can spend our golden years at senior citizens' homes. The tax authorities treat us as individuals and do not expect us to pay the neighbor's taxes. The courts, too, see us as individuals and never punish us for the crimes of our cousins, although increasingly with wokeness we're being punished for the crimes of our ancestors. Not only adult men, but also women and children are recognized as individuals. Throughout most of history, women are often seen as the property of family or community. Modern states, on the other hand, see women as individuals, enjoying economic and legal rights, independently of their family and community. They may hold their own bank accounts, decide whom to marry, and even choose to divorce or live on their own. But the liberation of individuals comes at a cost. Many of us now bewail the loss of strong family and communities and feel alienated and threatened by the power of the impersonal state and the impersonal state and market wields over our lives. States and markets composed of alienated individuals can intervene in the lives of their members much more easily than states and markets composed of strong families and communities. When neighbors in a high-rise apartment building cannot even agree on how much to pay their janitor, how can we expect them to resist the state? Now, it's really helpful to read an article like that and not think of family simply as a nuclear family, but as, in fact, a much larger extended family, as we might call it today. Okay, back to the Unheard article. Up to that point, women's movements encompassed both women who understood personhood in the context of family life, women as relational beings, and those who argued for women to be treated primarily as individuals, irrespective of the givens of sex or relational obligations. Medical control of fertility constituted a fundamental material change to this debate. It enabled the final victory of on the individual side. As my friend Erica Erica has argued, let's see if it was a Yankee Dutch name, I could say it no problem. Treating access to legal abortion as necessary precondition for personhood implies a liberal, male-centric understanding of what a person is. Oh, now isn't this interesting? To be male is to be an individual, and to be tied into a community is female. Within that framework, there's no conceptual language, for example, to describe the more than one but less than two nature of pregnancy. That's really clever. More than one, less than two. Or the radical sense of merged selfhood that comes from mothering a newborn baby. Well, what about fathering a family? Little blind to men in this article, but we'll keep going. For women to be human on this model, we must have total ownership over all of these aspects of our bodies that differ from those of males. Even a conflict between total autonomy and unborn human life must be resolved for autonomy. There exists feminist thinkers who contest this, but they have been marginal since the 1960s. For the mainstream, the enchantment of the radical body autonomy in law as baseline for human personhood signaled a conclusive defeat of relational feminism. That's very interesting, relational feminism. I think this also contributes to the loss of the feminine in culture, as Jonathan Peugeot points out in his observations of movies where basically women are men and women are masculine. Instead of calling for both men and women to embrace a human duty to be dependent on others, we embraced a supposed empowering pursuit of universal, desexed, radical individualism and outsourced care to the welfare state, similar to what Harari talked about. I think this isn't I don't think this is disconnected from deconstruction of Christians either, because it's a loss of faith in God and it's a loss of faith in each other. And it's an abundance of faith in ourselves until, of course, we realize that A, we might not be the self we thought we were in terms of a meaning crisis, and B, we might not be as reliable as we imagined ourselves to be. At this point, we tend to look back to the state and want institutions to be more reliable for us, but this is where, again, we're sort of caught in a trap, because with increasing distrust of institutions, we don't trust ourselves. Who can we turn around to trust in? In fact, our entire society has trust issues. Received opinion today frames this shift as a victory. Conservative critiques of feminism usually boil down to enumerations of its uncounted costs: the meltdown of the family life, tiny infants in daycare, the degradation of sexual intimacy, and the collapse of fertility rate, and so on. But we need to understand that what we're fighting over is not feminism. So, okay, not my feminism. Again, I don't mean to be too hard on the article. It's just labels are fraught. And so, okay, well, what are we talking about if we don't have labels? What we're fighting about is not feminism properly understood. Of course, I make these arguments about Christianity all the time, but something I've characterized elsewhere as bio-libertarianism. Ooh, new labels. So if we don't like our old labels, we make new ones, and maybe we can improve. And again, I do the same thing. A worldview that for 50 years now has claimed to act in women's interests, but it is increasingly obviously at odds with those interests. It's a worldview. And part of the difficulty with making arguments like this is you're both arguing about the interests and identity of something. And if neither of those things are terribly fixed, it's going to be difficult to sort of broker and negotiate something between them, although we almost always have to do that on the fly in real life. It's a worldview that believes human freedom necessitates radical unmooring from the givens of our bodies. The transgender writer Jennifer Finley Boylan recently observed that the campaigns for medical abortion and transgender surgeries have a great deal in common. This is correct. Both causes champion the rights of atomized individuals to exert absolute mastery of their bodies. They are not feminist, but bio-libertarian. This is fascinating. I disagree with Boylan only on whether this is desirable, because conditions have now changed again, and our norms and laws haven't caught up yet. Bio-libertarian causes may have appeared in women's emancipatory interests in a broadly democratic consumer society. That era retains some shared social and cultural norms, along with a sincere belief that things could go on getting better, richer, freer, more comfortable forever. As such, working loose those old-fashioned social norms and psychological givens seems an unalloyed good. That world is gone, so count this author as a pessimist. There are no shared norms. We're past peak oil. Living standards are falling. So is life expectancy. Variously, in the name of economic progress, digital disintermediation, COVID, net zero, or the Great Reset, the middle class is being methodically cannibalized to shore up the 1%. Pluralism has birthed a Hobbesian moral anarchy, held together only by the technologies that mediate our meme wars. That's quite a paragraph. This is the new normal, and it's not going away. Against this backdrop, the interests of men and women no longer align with bio-libertarian agenda of mastery over the body. And this brings me to the three main types of response I notice in the new tension between emerging conditions and our legacy social and cultural frameworks: trads, cads, and radfems. I like these labels. These are fun. Very reductively, these three positions break down as follows. The trads say, all this could be fixed if only we could put second-wave feminism back in its box and return to something more like cult of domesticity. This has the appeal of both familiarity and nostalgia. But we no longer live in the industrial society that produced those roles. The economic landscape has changed beyond all recognition. Arguing over the merits of those changes won't reverse them. And today's reality is that the trad argument is pure fantasy fiction for the millions of 20-somethings who can barely make rent, let alone support an unwaged, I think it's a typo, career for little kids. Now this is fascinating, and this gets into a whole variety of things, because I know the bunch of trads in my audience, but also into the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Because one of the things that comes through in that podcast is, in fact, Driscoll sort of, well, we're gonna get back to trad basically by bullying you into it. And that's part of the complaint about many of the refugees from that movement, who my guess is continue to remain fairly conservative and continue to hold a fairly traditionalist view of marriage and family in the world. Nor is the sexual revolution going back in its box. In fact, a fact that today produces cads of both sexes, men and women who have internalized the radically individualist bio-libertarian beliefs that sex is merely a fun leisure activity that can be managed via contract theory. Among high-status men, this looks like Tinder hookups summoned as casually as Deliveroo Pizza. I don't know if that's where this woman lives. Hilarious name. For the less fortunate, it looks like the embittered life of porn-sick incel. Among women, the same dynamic looks like classes of college freshmen on how to launch yourself on OnlyFans, like consenting reluctantly to violence or degrading sexual practices in the hope that it will make a boy like you enough to hold your hand in public. For both sexes, it means an interpersonal landscape marinated with pornography, actively hostile to intimacy, and governed by false belief that male and female sexuality are the same. Under its rubric, the pursuit of pleasure becomes a degraded search for thrills, one which leaves both the sexes numb and jaded, scarred by having traded in love for violence. The cads have accepted the situation and resigned themselves to just scavenging whatever kicks they can get. Others revolt against this nihilistic nightmare by calling for the re-imposition of power in the interest of final victory for one sex over the other. In this cause, radfems, in fact, encompass both feminists and anti-feminists. They have a surprising amount in common. Radical feminism is rich and fractious tradition that I clearly can't do justice to here, but its contemporary inheritors take for granted the individualist liberal anthropology I have described. The anti-feminism that opposes this view is just as individualistic. It simply prefers not to extend selfhood to women. What's interesting here is that, in many ways, what we're fighting over, again, sort of reminds me of the modernist fundamentalist fights in Christianity, where both sort of implicitly shared whole ranges of assumptions and then just at the top, fought on the surface. To some degree, John Vervaeke and I were talking about that in our conversation about non-theism and classical theism. Both believe in the same patriarchy. They differ only on its merits. Both are similarly hostile to interdependence. Both these groups, in different ways, argue for the use of power to settle the war between the sexes, and either for or against the patriarchy. Now, I'm not sure about this argument she's making here. I know that So let's line this up, let's say, between the rise and fall of Mars Hill on one side, which would be, enforced patriarchy. I don't think you're going to put women's consent back in the box either. And to the degree that people are choosing to go trad, in that sense, they are choosing to do so postmodernly. And so what tends to happen, at least on the left, is you raise the specter of domination. But when I look at people on the right, trads in fact, I don't see a lot of domination. I see a lot of women actually making these decisions for themselves and saying, we choose this, which then sets up the very interesting dynamic of tyranny from the left. And, we've watched this back and forth now for a while. And so to set this up sort of as, well, both of these sides are tyrannical. Well, I think, again, this is an example of not taking yes for an answer. Because when I look at the complementarian churches, for the most part, and I'm sure there are some out there that are brutally repressive, for the most part, I see the women that are involved as having chosen to do so. But this is where we get into the conflicted nature of postmodern consent. Because if there's anything that postmodernity attacks in terms of what we've seen in critical race theory and some of these other areas, it's consent itself. And once consent is attacked, well, then you've pretty much destroyed modernity. And because we've attacked institutions of authority, you're hard-pressed to decide, well, where are you really going to go now? We are in the throes of renegotiating now, for the age of abundance is over. I'm not sure about that. Neo-feudalism is already here. It's underwritten by an emerging biosecurity state that disciplines and surveys our bodies as it even proposes to terraform our souls. It would re-regulate human nature itself, open up our bodies as markets of biotech, applaud males for embracing a surgically feminized gender identity, and while rebranding females as gestators, chest feeders, and birthing bodies, or just uterus havers. Men and women face this disunited, no longer sure how to live together. Family formation is collapsing. Antinatalism is hip. Millions of young people are trapped in a hell of transactional sexuality, ordered not to love or meaning or the future, but to bear squalid hyper-mediated commerce. Now, you can read the whole article. She's not done there. She's not done yet, but it's a good piece, and it really is a critique from the left of feminism and what it's become. Towards the end of last week, I didn't have any time to make any video of it last week, but I caught this video from Rebel Wisdom on the modern dating economy, and I want to play some portions of it. And I really saw it in the light of this article that I just read.
I'm super excited for the conversation today with James Bloodworth. He is a journalist, writer, and the creator of the podcast Modern Dating Economy. He's also known for his journalistic work on the gig economy. So we're going to talk today about...
Now, it's not coincidental that a guy is dealing both with the gig economy and the modern dating economy. Because, of course, if you see them in the light of some of the dynamics that the previous article laid out, they're the same thing. The modern dating economy is a gig economy because structures, authorities, trust have sort of been ripped away. But what's fascinating is now here we have people that say, well, what do I want? Well, if you, again, I can't find any better example of this than the unkillable. I mean, if the last season of The Bachelor didn't kill the franchise, the thing can't be killed. The Bachelorette. Because if you watch this program, it is just dripping with longing for permanence and stability. And now the tremendously cross-pressured creators of this show are sort of tiptoeing through the minefields, and you watch that with enforced language in the program because everyone is looking for their person. But of course, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, you can't have an LGBT bachelorette or bachelor show because all of the contestants for the love of the person on the top of the hierarchy, they'd all hook up with each other and the whole thing would disappear. So it's fueled by the gender binary, and it can't be destroyed without destroying this. Yet I'm looking for my person, and my person will be my person for life. And they have all of these breathless, just, rather dates, which are sort of interviews with each other, where they're demanded to air their vulnerability and their dirty laundry. And my parents have the ideal relationship. Well, my parents, my father never married my mother and he abandoned us at the age of 2, and my mother did the best we could, but she had an alcohol problem. And, so it's kind of the gig economy, isn't it? But yet into it we go. And you're not going to undo all of the changes in our context that have given us Tinder and dating apps and everything else. We're just trying to survive our own success.
Dating, mating, and the dynamics that we find ourselves in. He's done a lot of work on this and has a really interesting perspective to share with all of us. Hi, James. It's
good. It's great to be here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
So one of the first things that catches my eye with your work is the name of your podcast, which is The Modern Dating Economy. So can you talk a little bit about the usage of that word, what you think it draws forth and allows us to see about the problem of modern dating, and then also what are the drawbacks of using that term?
Yeah, sure. So the reason I called the podcast The Modern Dating Economy, I mean, the first reason was that was the best name I could come up with. I couldn't think of anything better.
Now, again, modern dating economy situates us in the marketplace, as Harari and this other author noted.
But it was also because with dating apps, we have all this data now on romance, essentially. We have all this data that we didn't have previously from more kind of spontaneous ways that people got together, whether it's at a bar, a coffee shop, whatever.
And so now you also have the authority of the market, and the authority of the market is sussed out scientifically by polling. And well, now we don't really know what we want or what we need, but we're going to head into this in order to achieve. Well, what do we want to achieve? Well, we want to achieve this vision that we've had before us of finding my person, et cetera, et cetera.
But dating apps have furnished us with all this data. And when as we're kind of getting more of this data and we're understanding it more, one of the things that's striking about an app like Tinder, for example, is there's this level of inequality on there. So, and
again, well, now we've got the bugbear of inequality. I just realized that bugbear is a word I've used for years and never once looked up and thought, ooh, I should be sure of that word. What's a bugbear? A cause of obsessive fear, irritation, or loathing. Yeah, good word.
I think that so for example, the average man on Tinder or something is not doing very well. And then you have a small percentage of people, men typically, who are doing very well. And it's quite useful. It's quite useful metaphor when explaining this to people to kind of talk about it in terms of, say, compare it to a country. So like if Tinder was a country, it would be one of the most unequal countries in the world. So that's the utility of the comparison to an economy.
Now, it'd be very interesting to ask ourselves, because again, equality is this ultimate good. We've placed it at the top of our moral hierarchies. What does equality look like in a dating app? What does equality look like in the realm of mate selection? If you're average, you get average. It's really difficult to not sort of perpetually go back to Brave New World, where you're unable to deny a request for sex from another person. And given what our ascendant morality says are the new terms, well, here we are. Last week, Colin Wright posted on Twitter pointing to a thread from a woman: is a lesbian transphobic if she does not want to have sex with a trans woman? Yes, let me explain why. I just learned this myself a few months ago. Well, now has new information about the moral truth of the universe that she is just willing to share with us all on Twitter. How about this? I went to a trusted friend who helped me work out why this is problematic when I couldn't see it for myself. Okay, it's very interesting. Right in the language of that tweet, you have our contemporary dance with respect to authority and, quote unquote, thinking for ourselves. She manages in that sentence to have it both ways. I just learned this myself. Okay, so now it's something I know. I went to a trusted friend who helped me work out why this is problematic. Okay, why it's a sin, because problematic now means sin, when I couldn't see it for myself. So I learned it from a friend, but I internalized it. And so now I can speak with this authoritatively because I learned it from a friend, maybe ideally from a transgender friend. And so now I can speak to it from authority. The problem here is generalization. Oh, we're going to live without that now, are we? Generalization is a human cognitive bias habit created to help us make quick life or death decisions in the wild. Oh, just in the wild, huh? Not in my office or on the street, or when I see a Mack truck coming for me, I generalize to imagine that it weighs tons and my 240-pound self will be smushed by it. Oh, but that's a generalization. This creature has fur and is very large. Run. The creature has fur and is very small. Kill it and eat it. Those are the two choices. This is how human brains work. This is how human brains are wired. Oh, so now we have sort of a mechanistic justification for it. This is our anatomy. Okay, this is given to us by nature. Must be good. Okay, so we generalize pretty much everything and everyone at this time. This isn't in itself terrible. It's just a brain thing. Okay, glad I am free from my brain thing to look at my brain thing. I don't know what I'm thinking with besides the brain thing that is captive to all of this, but let's continue. But the problem happens when we build social groups and societies. Oh, wow, there's a ghost. It was Halloween last night. There was a ghost. It was the ghost of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's just a brain thing. It's just natural to us. But when we build societies, it's a problem. Okay. Life gets complicated. You don't say. This habit no longer serves us well in modern life. Oh, well, we got ghosts of modernity here. And this basically is Brett Weinstein's argument about just about everything. Well, religion no longer serves us well in modern life. Oh, okay. So we can use a lot of evolutionary psychology to dismiss a bunch of things. We aren't on the plains or in the jungle making quick life or death decisions anymore. Don't cross a street. We're navigating complex social systems. Oh, that's true. But are efficient, read lazy. Now we've moralized generalization, haven't we? We've moralized the tools we use to address combinatorial explosiveness. Still want to make quick choices, saying things like, all football players are dumb and I don't date one, is one of these snap decisions. Okay. I think you're a little alone in that. A lot of people seem willing to date football players. Our brains are a little bit tougher to sort of dispel with an argument about the no longer needed mode of generalization to address combinatorial explosiveness. It's kind of like broad brush painting a football player is at odds with modern morals. Oh, that's modern morals. Someone will inevitably say something to counteract it and remind us that your generalizations are not okay. I don't know if she imagines her line of argumentation is generalization safe. This is a generalization safe space or clean room. My dad is a former linebacker at Ohio State and the Cleveland Browns, and now he's a mathematician for Pfizer. Wow, that's quite a dad. A bigot, my, have we generalized? Will hold steadfast to their original generalizations. You haven't generalized the bigot now, have you? Your dad was never meant to be a football player then. Meant? Now we have divine agency crept into this land free of generalization and authority? This is what people do to get over cognitive dissonance. Oh, okay. People do a lot of things to get over cognitive dissonance. Or dissonance. Cognitive dissonance they tend to want to kill. But that's a generalization. When a person says they will not date trans women, they are making a very wide generalization that dehumanizes individuals. Ah, individuals. It doesn't address personal preferences. Oh, like, I prefer to F vaginas over penises. It assumes that each kind and every trans person is exactly the same. Remember the life or death decisions that when we're faced with big, hairy, wild animals. Is the wilderness more deadly than stepping outside my door? Depends on the day. Because, you know, the biggest, hairiest, wildest, most dangerous animal in all the world? It's us. Lots of fur. The same fear is driving people to reject outright every individual that shares a characteristic. In other words, being trans. Well, how about being bigoted? Are you going to welcome bigots because not all bigots are the same, that bigots are generalizations? This fear drives the I must flee reaction. Transphobia is I must flee. Just watch The Crying Game. Please, will someone please remake The Crying Game? I want to see it done. Originally, I saw this I don't date trans people in the same generalization. I asked my friend, what is the problem with a lesbian saying she doesn't want to F with a penis? Boy, that can go so many ways. That seemed legit. Oops. How my friend asked, is a person supposed to know upon meeting a person what their genitals look like? I thought that was the purpose of dating. Just ask Jacob and the Veils. Read the book of Genesis. Plus, let us not get into the whole argument of seeing a person as valuable only based on their genitals. Gosh, this is incredible. Putting that aside and assuming a person wants only a set of goods. See my video. See, this is why I had to post my video of Jan that I'm probably not saying his name right, that I had voted today about people being a list of attributes. Because, you know, she's making some important points in here, but it's not that you're going to know people apart from the attributes. You've just set up a value hierarchy and saying their physicality is unimportant. Really? Now we go back to rebel wisdom and say, well, what do we now know about dating? But I just can't finish this thread. I just can't leave it alone yet. It's just too good. Putting that aside and assuming a person wants only a certain set of goods. How do you know until they get close to that person? I don't know. What's amazing is this bouillabaisse of evolutionary psychology and ascendant morality. 30 years ago, when you'd watch some documentary on public television, they would tell you that people do mate selection on the basis of characteristics. Do they have good-looking hair? Do they have certain body types? Well, these things communicate. These things communicate fertility to us, even though we're going to stomp the fertility out of people medically until we just want to have our one or two precious beings to sort of to find and fulfill ourselves and complete ourselves. Some big hairy animals mean us no fear. Some trans women have vaginas. Now we have the choice. Now we all have the choice to be prejudiced. Wait a minute. Is prejudice pre-rational? Is it pre-volitional? Is that what the word means? I mean, people are always like, oh, wokeism. It's like this stuff just comes apart in your hands. You just start looking at this stuff and it just simply falls apart. It can't stand the light of its own economy. My friend helped me see the larger generalization problem that I had missed. I was thinking that it was okay for lesbians not to want to F with penises, but I was missing the fact that bigoted people were throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Those bigoted baby-throwing people. Details and individuals matter. Do they? And it's definitely okay for lesbians to not be interested in penises. Wait. Where did this thread start? You first said it was bigoted for lesbians to not be interested in penises. That was problematic. And now you say it's definitely okay for them. And it's like, wow, this is unimaginable. I realize there are arguments for this, but I think it is extreme. Now, what was really hilarious is if you just read the responses to this tweet. Where's Colin's response? Oh no, did I not get Colin's response in here? Colin's response basically said, "You've just destroyed the argument for respecting gay rights." He's right. Oh, okay. Back to the world we know by science. I think
there's a downside to it in that you can, so it can be too kind of formulaic, and if you reduce everything to, it can be too reductive. So if you reduce everything to kind of look at everything through this prism of economics or whatever, or the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule is talked about, I think it can be a bit too reductive. And I think that is sometimes then conspiracy theories and radicalization can happen to people when they do go down this kind of reductive path where they think that dating apps is hopeless for them to use them. Only a certain kind of person has any chance of romance in the modern world. So I think there is a pitfall to it, like a dark side.
Dating apps are hopeless to use them. Without a breath pause, romance is impossible in the modern world. You mean it's enforcement of dating apps?
As well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that draws me to that metaphor, although I do agree that there are limitations in terms of reducing really highly complex social dynamics into economic and game theoretic term, is that you're able to see the situation.
I really liked her. She was really good.
From a God's eye view. It kind of puts you into the perspective of looking at population dynamics.
It puts us into the perspective of the monarchical vision,
which is absolutely necessary for understanding how there are different people in this game who have different positions, right? So there's different subsets of the population, like you just spoke to, that there is a subset of men who are doing quite well in this dating economy. And then there's a larger group.
Now, it's interesting, the terms that we use in here, doing quite well. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're getting a lot of dates. They're probably getting a lot of sex. They have a large number of women who are interested, but this is where things, I mean, if you sort of follow this along, large number of women who are interested in what? Because again, the interests of the women and the interests of men, dare we generalize, are in some ways counter to each other, but as much as we think, as much as we don't think, individuals
group that aren't doing as well. And so they kind of have different dynamics in the game. So could you talk a little bit about each of these different populations that you see emerging in the dating economy and what different characteristics they have?
Now, I really like the chads, cads, and super femmes here, because basically we're going to see the dating life of the cads.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a great deal of inequality in online dating, let's call it, and I think that I think that's real. So it is a mistake to say that people are only angry because they've been fed this narrative that it's an economy and there's all this inequality, this kind of Pareto principle narrative. Or
it's like, how would it not be an economy? What we're dealing with here are profiles, profilicity. What are profiles? Profiles are a way that we can basically distill a human being down into a set of characteristics. Now, I posted 2 conversations today. The second conversation, I've had a backlog of material, so I know some of you have been crying under the load that I've been putting out. But so I've made this friend in San Francisco, and we've been chatting on Twitter for a while. We met for lunch a couple of weeks ago, and we finally got around to doing a conversation. And part of what I do with conversations is I take notes while I'm talking in my conversation, because I then usually grab some things out of it for the title. And he's working on a master's. He was involved in the tech industry for a while, worked for companies developing artificial intelligence, and now he's working on his master's thesis in philosophy around this area of personhood and what people are. And so I took some of the salient points of our conversation out of it. We treat people like tech, like feature lists. Absurdity is the divorce between actor and setting. And when you look at this, you look at what we're doing. Let's see, did I lose that tab? No, there it is. When we look at what we're doing here in dating apps, well, this is exactly what we do when we reduce people into profiles. Now, again, back to our Twitter list of generalization. Part of this we simply have to do, because we process each other in that way to a degree and a low resolution basis. But when we get into relationality, that's going to have to give way. And let's keep going with this piece.
80-20 conspiracy theory, whatever. I mean, there is an element of truth to that in the dating app world. So, for example, there's a lot of data from Tinder specifically, and also Hinge, I believe, and OkCupid from a few years ago. That was one of the bigger dating apps, mid 2010s, I think it was. And there's a lot of data which shows that, a small number I'll talk about it first from the male perspective, I suppose. A small number of men typically do very well. And I'd say, it's obviously like men who are good looking, but a lot of it's to do with knowing how to present yourself.
Now, this is interesting. This whole issue of profilicity or persona or profiles.
So you can be good looking and just have like bathroom mirror selfies with, flecks of toothpaste on the mirror, and
I listen to these things and it makes me feel so old, because of course none of this was around in the 1980s when I was a 20-something, wanting to find a wife, et cetera, et cetera.
You don't know how to present yourself. So a lot of this world today, whether it's romance or work, it's about how you can present yourself. It's not necessarily your achievements. It's about how well you can present those achievements.
And I thought that was interesting. Well,
present those attributes. So I think if you're not good at that, and lots of people aren't good at like presenting themselves, they're already going to be lower down the pecking order on a dating app. And the other thing I suppose is with dating apps, you're formalizing preferences through these very narrow funnels. So I've spoken about this before, but when I was younger, height was never such a big issue in terms of like being a man.
It's good to be Dutch.
I have friends of mine who 5'7", 5'8", and they never really had a complex about it. I mean, yeah, some people do, but it was never an issue. They never thought really, oh, I'm not going to be able to find a partner because I'm this height. Whereas now there seems to be this fixation on. It's become like a meme, as a guy, you must be 6 foot. And you see women on dating apps saying that you must be 6 foot in their profile. And I feel that is a cultural change that's been basically brought about by dating apps. And then you have men who fall below that. They transpose that onto real life and think, I'm never going to meet anyone because all
Notice the move. They transpose that onto real life. This is very interesting.
This is what women want. You have to be like 6 foot and stuff. I mean, it's in reality, it's like,
and no amount of height isn't something that we've very successfully been able to really jigger with human beings.
It's much more complex than that. But I think that's one example of how some men feel like disenfranchised by dating apps. And for women, I mean, many women feel disenfranchised for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Which is hilarious because, almost the first thing that people say when they meet me is, you're taller than you are on YouTube. I'm in this little box. I'm on your smartphone, or maybe I'm on your TV and my head is really big. This is fascinating.
Reasons. So it tends to be a barrage of kind of unwanted attention and unwelcome approaches. So, the dick pics and it's the social media thing, the dick pics, and just crude approaches and over-sexualized objectification, that kind of thing. So it's men and women, I think, both have different challenges. Like both have challenges. It's just, I think they're very, very different.
Yes. I mean, I think that's part of what makes it necessary to put this into the frame of an economy in some sense, is that the different players in the game have very different problems. Women are facing different issues. Some of them are very successful on these platforms. They're very good at presenting an image of themselves and they're doing quite well. And then there are men who are thrust into a different situation because of these like inherent asymmetries between the sexes that become apparent when you're looking at the dynamics in the dating economy. And then even in those groups, you have differences, right? Like within the group of men in particular, there's such a stark difference between the men who are, let's say, winning in the game, getting dates, getting attention from women, and the men who are not, right?
And then the question is, of course, well, we'd like to say they're winning. Well, what are they winning? Are they winning really? Because what is it exactly that they want? Or are they, in fact, divorced from their wants? Are we also completely postmodern that they are, in fact, divorced from the goods that they should have, and they're just completely out of touch with the goods that they should be pursuing?
And then also there's this insidious aspect of this whole situation, which is Tinder or any of these dating apps as the mediators and changing the algorithms in order to get more time on site and manipulating the people on the platforms. So there's in a sense, they are also nudging.
And some of the stuff that's come out of this is where, Tinder they'll put up false profiles and they'll put up, better looking profiles in order to keep people on the site. And all the while we're sitting there having these hand-wringing, pearl-clutching moral questions about equality. And it's like, well, the site is totally making sure it's unequal at all, because what we're really dealing with is the fantasy in your brain.
This situation to have these kinds of population dynamics. So I think that's part of the difficulty of the question. and even why, certain people get siloed into these very specific positions and they can't get out of them. I'll just also say that for the audience, they can put questions into the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the conversation. I forgot to mention that earlier. But yeah, so I'm interested in, okay, what is happening to the male in this situation who is not getting access to female attention? What do you see going on in our society as a result of this shift?
I think we see a process of radicalization happening. I think we see that most obviously through the example of the incel. It's not really a community. There is no incel community. It's not even really a movement. It's kind of atomized individuals who sometimes congregate on certain forums. There is an ideology, but that's slightly different. But I think you see a process of radicalization. So, I mean, if I go back to when I was late teenager, early 20-something, I lived in the countryside at the time in Somerset from when I was like 17 until about 22, 23. I didn't have a girlfriend. I was like I had, a couple of friends, but I was quite socially isolated. My social skills atrophied because I spent too much time in the house.
I lived before this stuff, and, I didn't have a girlfriend until it was, we have this. Part of what we're dealing with also is the old mass media that simply projected on everyone that, young people were going to be radically successful in terms of finding mates at a very early age. Well, some do and some don't. All of these expectations and desires have all been pre-cooked by all these different layers of the images that we are living within.
Essentially, just listening to heavy metal and smoking weed, and funnily enough, that wasn't what women wanted. That wasn't. I
love that line. You mean it's like, I can't figure out why Jordan Peterson got so popular.
That wasn't what women were interested in. Yeah, believe it or not. The Warhammer set and the Star Wars set and whatever. But at the time, I could kid myself.
It was thoroughly colonized by one commercial mass media property, and oh, that's against my long-term interests. And part of what we're dealing with is the question of how can we know these long-term interests, and this was part of where John Vervaeke and I got into in terms of that conversation, because we're doing all this dead reckoning down here, but we really need we want to get up above it. That's basically what modernity attempts to offer us, but it can't fully offer that to us because, in a sense, we rise up only to look down when we really want to look up.
Myself, though, I had that ego protection mechanism, so I could kid myself and be like, if I wanted to get a girlfriend, I could do it. If I really wanted to, I could meet someone, and I could protect my ego that way. Whereas I think today is very different, because today you have a dating app, and the bar for entry to create a profile on the dating app and to log on is much lower than it was in my day to, say, go and approach a woman in a bar or a coffee shop. So that would you'd have to pluck up a lot of guts to do that, and it would.
And part of what's interesting, and there's that graph that was floating around Twitter about where people are finding each other. You'd go to school to meet girls. You'd go to church to meet girls. You'd go hang out in public spaces in your neighborhood to meet girls. I mean, you might have scared to death of them, but they were there, and you'd retreat back to your clutch of your guy friends and, talk about what miserable, hopeless idiots you were. And then you'd have, hopefully, sisters who could begin to indoctrinate you into the ways of girls. And your sisters would help you understand. But there are many, many layers here that are contributing to this.
The rejection could be brutal. And, you have to go through quite a lot to do that if you've not done that before. Whereas with the dating app, the bar for entry is very low. So anyone can set up a profile. But then if
Anybody could set up a profile and be rejected.
you don't know how to present yourself, if you are kind of near the bottom of the hierarchy, so to speak, in terms of what works on the dating app, you then enter essentially a negative feedback loop, and your identity is formed within that negative feedback loop. So it's revealed to you where you sit in the hierarchy. And
if I weren't in mortal terror of my wife, part of me would want to set up like a fake profile in a dating app, because of course I have zero understanding of this entire world. And I listen to this with just it's sort of the way that I look at The Bachelorette and those shows. It's just fascinated horror at what has become of us.
I'm kind of glad I didn't have that revealed to me when I was like a 19-year-old or whatever. And I think what's happening today is you do get that. It's kind of rubbed in your face a bit more. So the sheer volume of rejection on a dating app. I mean, I've had friends.
Back in the old days when you finally mustered up the courage to ask some female to something that approximated a date, at least you only got shot down, every 3 or 4 months when you could muster the courage. now it's just, it's gotta be awful.
Who know I talk about this stuff sometimes, who've then contacted me and said they've had to delete dating apps because it's affected their mental health.
Yeah, I could see that.
And so then I think there is this kind of ready-made ideology with the incel community, say the black pill, it's called, this kind of very deterministic ideology, which says that, only someone with, a certain jawline is going to try.
Hey, buddy, if you don't have the jawline, grow a good beard. Then maybe you can't do that either.
I think of some celebrity with the stereotypical jaw, like the Chad jawline, or like the 6'2" Chad or whatever. They're the only. It's
6'2" is short.
It's like the stereotype's the only person who has any chance of finding a partner, and they're the ones. And also then
my masculinity is wasted on the world. I'm already taken, ladies. Sorry. This is insanity.
There's a conspiracy theory, like you feel like everyone else is having sex, but you're not. And I think that's also propagated by the kind of Instagram world of like the Dan Bilzerians of the world, where it's rubbed in your face, these men who seem to have this like incredible lifestyle, and you're comparing yourself to those men. And
it's so fascinating to me having men now being, hearing male complaints that are in some ways, like opposite the complaints I've heard from women all my life. Well, can't get a date because I don't look hot like that woman over there, and why everybody in the class wants to date these tiny little clique of women. And I mean, this has been the fodder of how many teenage comedies and shows, because it's hierarchy, and eventually spread people out enough and things sort of flatten out. But part of what this easy connected world we're living in is these hierarchies are just shooting straight up.
I think, that sends people down into this, into this pit of despair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
I know the pit of despair. I lived in there for a long time in this realm. I mean, it's part of it is a sort of a male rite of passage to get shot down and humiliated, and well, maybe not all of you, but I've been there.
It feels like, in a way, men are kind of facing a similar situation that women have been in for millennia, which is being judged by their innate beauty rather than,
yeah, dudes, how do you like it?
than the qualities of their character. And that being such a massive force. Now
that gets interesting. The qualities of our character. Oh, and quite true, because if now we're going to expand the palette here, because now if in fact you're committing to someone even in a bachelorette way, that this is your person and for life. And I mean, the expectations, Becker wrote about this, and I should pull up that quote. It's on my blog. Before I ever heard of Jordan Peterson, I heard of Ernest Becker's book. And I heard about it through a Tim Keller sermon. And so what I was doing back in the aughts was listening to Tim Keller sermons and then tracking down his references, because I figured if he's pulling out a big diamond, there's probably more diamonds in that hill that he pulled it out of. Once we realize that what the religious solution did, we can see how modern man edged himself into an impossible situation. He still needed to feel heroic, meaning to know that his life mattered in the scheme of things. He still had to be specially good for something truly special. Also, he still had to merge himself with some higher, self-absorbing meaning in trust and in gratitude. What we saw was the universal motive of the agape merger. If we no longer had God, how was he to do this? One of the first ways that occurred to him, as Rank saw, was the romantic solution. He fixed his urge to cosmic heroism onto another person in the form of a love object. The self-glorification that he needed in his inmost nature, he now looked for in the love partner. The love partner becomes the divine ideal within which to fulfill one's life. All spiritual and moral needs now become focused on one individual, my person. Spirituality, which once referred to another dimension of things, is now brought down to this earth and given form in another individual human being. Salvation itself is no longer referred to as an abstraction like God, but can be sought in the beatification of the other. We would call this transference beatification. Man now lives in a cosmology of two. To be sure, all through history there's been some competition between human objects of love and divine ones. We think of Eloise and Abelard, Alcibiades and Socrates, or even the Song of Solomon. But the main difference is that in a traditional society, the human partner would not absorb into himself the whole dimension of the divine. In modern society, he does. In case we are inclined to forget how deified the romantic love object is, the popular songs continually remind us. They tell us that the lover is the springtime, the angel glow, with eyes like stars, that the experience of love will be divine, like heaven itself. And so on. Popular love songs have surely had this content from ancient times, and will likely continue to have it as long as there remains a mammal and as long as man remains a mammal and a cousin of the primates. These songs reflect the hunger for real experience, a serious emotional yearning on the part of the creature. The point is that if the love object is divine perfection, then one's own self is elevated by joining one's destiny to it. One has the highest measure of one's ideal striving, all of one's inner conflicts and contradictions, the many aspects of guilt. All of these can try to purge in a perfect consummation with perfection itself. This has become the true moral vindication of the other. Modern man fulfills his urge to self-expansion in the love object, just as it was once fulfilled in God. God, as representation of our own will, does not resist us except when we ourselves want it. And just as little does the lover resist us, who, indeed, subjects himself to our will. In one word, the love object is God. As a Hindu song puts it, my lover is like God. If he accepts me, my existence is utilized. It's high meaning in that phrase. No wonder Rank could conclude that the love relationship of modern man is a religious problem. As we know from our own experience, this method gives great and real benefits. Is one oppressed by the burden of life? Then he can lay it at his divine partner's feet. Is self-consciousness too painful? The sense of being a separate individual, trying to make some kind of meaning out of who one is, what life is, and the like. Again, all of this, comes from the rise of the individual. Then one can wipe it away in the emotional yielding to the partner, forget oneself in the delirium of sex, and still be marvelously quickened in the experience. Is one weighed down by the guilt of his body, the drag of his animality that haunts his victory over death and decay? But this is just what the comfortable sex relationship is for. In sex, the body and the consciousness of it are no longer separated. The body is no longer something we look at as alien to ourselves. As soon as it is fully accepted as a body by the partner, our self-consciousness vanishes. It merges with the body and with self-consciousness and the body of the partner. 4 fragments of existence melt into one unity, and things are no longer disjointed and grotesque. Everything is natural, functional, expressed as it should be. And so it is stilted and justified. Now, prophilicity is really going to wreak havoc with this, because now the divine is not just created by the love between two settled expectations. I don't know if it was Saturday Night Live or Mad TV used to have the series of lowered expectations, something of that fact. All the more is guilt wiped away when the body finds its natural usage in the production of a child. Nature herself then proclaims one's innocence. How fitting it is that one should have a body, be basically a procreative animal. But now the rub for man. If sex is a fulfillment of his role as an animal in the species, it reminds him that he is nothing himself but a link in the chain of being, exchangeable with any other and completely expendable in himself. Sex represents then species consciousness, and as such, the defeat of individuality, of personality. And you can see in both the incels and the cads, you're going to wind up in the same place. Either the God has denied you, or the God is basically undressed. But it is just this personality that man wants to develop. The idea of himself as a special cosmic hero with special gifts for the universe. He doesn't want to be merely a fornicating animal like any others. This is not a truly human meaning, a truly distinctive contribution to the world life. From the beginning, then, the sexual act represents a double negation by physical death and of distinctive personal gifts. This point is crucial because it explains why sexual taboos have been at the heart of human society since the very beginning. They affirm the triumph of human personality over animal sameness. With the complex codes of sexual self-denial, man was able to impose the cultural map for personal immortality over the animal body. He brought sexual taboos into being because he needed to triumph over the body, and he sacrificed the pleasure of the body to its highest pleasure of all self-perpetuating as a spiritual being throughout all eternity. This is the substitution that Rohim was really describing when he made his penetrating observation on the Australian Aboriginal. The repression and sublimation of the primal scene is at the bottom a totemistic ritual and religion, that is, the denial of the body as the transmitter of peculiarly human life. If you find the ideal love and you try to make it the sole judge of good and bad in yourself, the measure of your striving, you will become simply the reflex of another person. You lose yourself in the other, just as obedient children lose themselves in the family. No wonder that dependency, whether of the good or the slave in the relationship, carried with it so much underlying resentment. As Rank put it, explaining the historical bankruptcy of romantic love, a person no longer wanted to be used as another's soul, even with its attendant compensations. When you confuse personal love and cosmic heroism, you are bound to fail in both spheres. The impossibility of the heroism undermines the love, even if it is real. As Rank so aptly says, this double failure is what produces the sense of utter despair that we see in modern man. It is impossible to get blood from a stone, to get spirituality from a physical body, and so one feels inferior in this life that his life has, somehow not succeeded, that he has not realized his true gifts, and so on. No wonder. Can a human being be God-like everything to another? No human relationship can bear the burden of godhood, and the attempt has to take its toll in some way on both parties. The reasons are not far to see. The thing that makes God the perfect spiritual object is precisely that he is abstract, as Hegel saw. He is not a concrete individuality, and so he does not limit our development by his own personal will and needs. When we look for the perfect human object, we are looking for someone who allows us to express our will completely, without any frustration or false notes. Now, that, of course, is what you're going to fail at if you actually enter into a relationship with another living, breathing human being. We want an object that reflects a truly ideal image of ourselves. But no human object can do this. Humans have wills and counter-wills of their own. In 1,000 ways they can move against us. Their very appetites offend us. God's greatness and power is something that we can nourish ourselves in without its being comprised in any way by the happenings of this world. No human partner can offer this assurance because the partner is, he says, real and very real, and also personal. However much we may idealize and idolize him or her, he inevitably reflects earthly decay and imperfections, and as he or she is our ideal measure of value, this imperfection falls back upon us. If your partner is all, then any shortcoming in him or her becomes a major threat to you. If a woman loses her beauty, or shows that she doesn't have the strength and dependability that we once thought she did, or loses her intellectual sharpness, or falls short of our own peculiar needs in any of 1,000 ways, then all the investment we have made in her is undermined. The shadow of imperfection falls over our lives, and with it, death and defeat of cosmic heroism. She lessens, I die. This is the reason for so much bitterness, shortness of temper, and recriminations in our daily family lives. We get back at a reflection of our loved ones that is less than the grandeur and perfection that we need to nourish ourselves. We feel diminished by their human shortcomings. Our interiors feel empty or anguished, our lives valueless. When we see the inevitable pettiness of the world expressed through the human beings in it. For this reason, too, we often attack loved ones and try to bring them down to size. We see that our gods have clay feet, and so we must hack away at them in order to save ourselves, to deflate the unreal overinvestment that we have made in them in order to secure our own apotheosis. In this sense, the deflation of the overinvested partner, parent, or friend is a creative act that is necessary in order to correct the lie that we have been living, to reaffirm our own inner freedom of growth that transcends the particular object and is not bound by it. And what you can see in these narratives where I need to find my person, but the bachelorette hardly ever comes to fruition. Why? Because of this very same dynamic. It's actually self-defeating.
In terms of having bidirectional selection. So it seems that there is a kind of situation occurring for men where they're having to face similar problems as women, where attractiveness is becoming more increasingly the primary currency of interpersonal attention.
And with the divination of romantic love, this stuff becomes existential.
Is that something that you've seen in your research, that looks and beauty is coming up as a more prominent value for people in terms of mate selection on both sides, both men and women?
Yes, I mean, I definitely think it is, because I think what we're talking about when we talk about like good looks, it's something that to some extent it's something that's biological and inherent, that there are certain traits which, cross-culturally.
Oh, unless you're Bene Gesserit, then you're just breeding it into your stock in order to arrive at the Dune Messiah.
Men and women tend to find attractive. So, women tend to, if you look cross-culturally, there tends to be more of a preference for, say, like high status men in positions of high status.
And again, the cross-cultural thing, even though all of us are in fact trapped in our cultures, we sort of rise above it. We're going to look cross-culturally because we're looking for the universal, we're looking for the biological.
And men cross-culturally, it tends to be a preference for women who are close to like their most fertile years, basically. But there are also lots of things which are socialized. And I think one interesting example of that is David Buss's book, The Evolution of Desire. There's a very interesting statistic, which is in every decade since the television age started, people would have rated the importance of good looks in a relationship more, because image and presentation has become more important. And I think I assume that social media has done that, accentuated that even more. So good looks almost become like a form of status in their own right. So I think that having kind of arm candy or whatever for men and women has become more of a, because you're more likely to appear in photos and they're more likely to go on Instagram or whatever in your grid, and then you show off your partner. It's kind of like a symbol of status in its own right, that you have a physically attractive partner. And I think social media has definitely played a massive role in that. And
one interesting little picture I picked up off Twitter, they have that whole equality, equity, and then someone riffed on that little meme and put capitalism, where you have, for those of you who are listening, equality, everyone's on the same size box. Equity, the tall person is on no box, the medium-sized person is on one box, and the small person is on two boxes, overlooking and basically getting to watch the baseball game without having to pay for a ticket. And then the third frame is capitalism, where they're just all awash in boxes and everybody is seeing the game, but of course the box is stacked. What's interesting about what's happening when they're talking about hierarchy here is how immaterial values have in many ways trumped the old value things. When everybody has an iPhone is no longer status. And that then gets back to Jordan Peterson and Rob Henderson's talk about these luxury beliefs and luxury morality, and now being able to attract a high status person and in effect secure that high status person then becomes basically luxury morality. And marriage, increasingly, I think, will probably also become a degree of luxury morality. If, in fact, you can achieve a lifelong partnership, the more and more rare that becomes, the more and more value it's going to be. And even though there's a lot of hand-wringing in religious communities about marriage and religion, I think basically what we're going to see over the long term, and I think we're already starting to see this now, is that people are once again embracing religious asceticism, devotion, and discipline as a luxury value. But because luxury is not so much counted necessarily in money or stuff. Now, again, experience has sort of replaced things as the ultimate luxury good. Exclusivity and fame have sort of dislodged brute stuff as the luxury good. Individual achievements that are increasingly rare will again be driven up the hierarchy.
And accentuate it. I think it's much more of a looks have become more important than they used to be, or have become more of a symbol of status.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that this kind of speaks to the dark side of the metaphor, right? The use of the word economy, I think, is a quite common one in our society to understand things in terms of economic language. And it's almost as if dating itself has become made into a lifestyle, right? So your interpersonal interactions have gone through this kind of lifestyle transformation. It's about your ability to advertise your position and status. So in a way, the connection between the economy and advertising has actually insidiously integrated itself into interpersonal dynamics between people. And while
it's interesting how she says this has sort of, put it in there. It's always been there. And it's just that we sort of had the vision that society was flat. And oh my goodness, society is, their market forces, impacting how people relate to one another. Really? Is that new? And you see this thing turning. So back a while ago when I played this clip from Aubrey Marcus on Chris Williamson, I didn't know who Aubrey Marcus was. But when he was talking about, so he was, he's this uber male who's just chasing tail. Yes, I had that in my Q&A. And poor Rick was over in the other room saying, "Stop saying chasing tail." And I was just thinking of a dog chasing its tail. I wasn't thinking of this kind of chasing tail. But so what can be better than polyamory? Actually, monogamy. It still is at the top of the hierarchy, to go back to my video about ideals and male female for life being the ideal. I don't think you get around that archetypal narrative. And I think even as we continue to churn through with all the new gifts that we have today, I think the ideals are going to continue to hold.
You know, there is a dimension of life that's about showing off and showing your position and getting scarce resources and demonstrating that as part of your status. There's also interpersonal relationships and skills and values and
See, and so then the other piece that I was reading, see, I complain about people forgetting where they started. This other piece that I was reading, the sexual revolution killed feminism. I'll bring back the creepy picture here. Fetishizing freedom harms all. Well, this is what she's talking about. This for her, this for Mary Harrington, this is the feminine.
Living an abundant life full of things that are going to make you feel content. And also potentially the desire to have a family in the mix. So what do you see as being the purpose of dating as such now? Like, has that even changed to be something that's not so focused on the outcomes of family and building community through dependable pair bonds, but rather is also morphing into this like kind of lifestyle advertising campaign for one's own personal brand or status? Like, what do you see going on with the way our values are shifting around relationships due to this technological change?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I kind of want to revisit some old, I mean, Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, he died like quite recently, but a few years ago, I remember reading one of his books in like 2008 or something. And it was called Liquid Love. And it was about kind of the throwaway capitalist culture.
Rod Dreher at his conference this weekend that I went to here in Sacramento was talking about Bauman and liquid modernity.
Moving into the realm of like relationships, and where there's always you're always looking for something better on the horizon, and like you trade up a partner or trade in a partner for a different one, and it's like a kind of throwaway disposable culture. And I think that was kind of prescient in many ways. I feel like I need to revisit it in light of dating apps, because I mean, I don't want to sound too much like a trad or something, because I'm not really. I'm more of a liberal. I think people should.
Oh, but we're all getting there, aren't we?
Pursue what makes them happy. If that doesn't sound too wishy-washy.
Too shallow, too disposable. Isn't that very, very much at the heart of that culture he's complaining about?
But it does feel a bit like personally, I would like to settle down at some point. I feel like there is that kind of deeper connection you can build with someone that isn't just the ephemeral app, based hookup or whatever. I feel like there is more of a richness to life when you can form a real connection with someone. But I think that the dating apps don't get rich off of happily ever afters. So they kind of well, first of all, there's some kind of scam going on where people pay money for upgrades on these apps and stuff, and then when they stop paying for this like extra package on there, they suddenly stop getting matches, and it's almost as if they're that once they've paid, if they hadn't paid, they would have still carried on getting matches. Once they have, I mean, I've heard this from quite a lot of people. There's kind of people are hooked in to kind of stay on there, and there's always this kind of grass is greener mentality that like the paradox of choice, where someone could be perfect for you in many ways, but it's like, what if I could just go and meet someone else tomorrow? Is like, I mean, this is true in real life in a place like Las Vegas, but in like normal life, it wasn't really true, I don't think, for many people until the advent of dating apps. I mean, all my friends in Las Vegas pretty much are permanently single, because the environment, there is that kind of paradox of choice. It's so easy to just go out and meet someone. And I think dating apps kind of make that something that's kind of applicable everywhere in some ways, which I don't think that's really a good thing. I think you can have too much choice in some ways. Well, not too much choice, but you can badly use the choice. You can. We're humans after all. We're not. No one is like perfectly disciplined all the time. We have kind of flaws, and we act on our emotions more than our logic, I think. And I don't think too much. I think there is such a thing sometimes as too much choice.
You can obviously watch the whole video, but this section I really wanted to get in.
Yeah,
Thanks is the short term.
I would say that there's a fundamental problem with desire that you could approach from a multitude of different perspectives. I think that we are kind of thrust into the question of what is our nature. And being social, we're picking up the desires of others quite extremely in terms of developing our own behavior and our own sense of what's worth, what's valuable in the society around us. And because we're inherently relational as a species, the paradigm of individualism, I think, gives us bad intuitions about what it is to actually achieve a fulfilling human life. And so I think a lot of what this has thrust us into is like very fundamental questions about what it means to be human, and desire as part of this set of questioning, because desire is this kind of the eros that drives interpersonal interaction, that gives us this boost, this drive to actually reach out into the unknown and attempt to do something that we don't understand what the outcomes of it are going to be. We have no security when we're trying to reach for a lover. We only know that we have this drive in us to go for them. And I think that kind of question of what do you desire? What are in your fantasy world? Are you spending so much time in your fantasy world constructing some platonic universe that you don't actually
I think a docetic universe.
know how to express desire through your body and through your interpersonal interaction?
And it's interesting how, again, this winds up being the expression of desire. When I was looking at Hans-Georg Müller's videos a little while ago about prophilicity, Robert Bellah came up. And again, the Robert Bellah's Habits of the Heart came up after his Civil Religion. Habits of the Heart was a book that he wrote in the 80s, a book that I had read in the 80s. And this question of, okay, well, what is all of this stuff for? Where's the meaning of this? How does this actually hold together?
With people, do you know that your desires are actually grounded in the world that you are aesthetically related to, that you're inside of and you're interacting with? And our desires are being pulled at us continuously through the hyper-real environment that we are spending our time on, right? And advertising and apps and, all of this kind of limbic hijacking is retraining our sense of desire, or I guess maybe you would say not retraining, but taking our evolutionary weaknesses, like our desire to look at beautiful faces, and exaggerating them to some kind of like a homunculus, this like strange homunculus of human existence that's about the weaknesses of our evolutionary proclivities, with leaving out.
It's amazing how beauty is in that way sort of deconstructed. There's a lot of conversation going. I need to have a conversation with Nate Heil. And part of one of the corners of this little corner of the internet, I mean, right now it's all about wisdom, beauty, and personalism.
The question of how do you live a balanced life? And I think these are upstream of the question of dating. This is more.
What is life for? Where does dating will be a subset of the question of what is life for? What is the good life? Again, back to Dallas Willard, The Divine Conspiracy, that I mentioned to Jonathan, to John Vervaeke.
More fundamental than how do I find a girlfriend? Like this, these are deep questions. That's my answer.
Well, it sounds like you're making the Übermensch case now, of like you have to figure out like what are the desires actually there for in the first place, and then provide what that was meant to provide, because you can't trust it with all the modern influences. Like, am I picking up what you're putting down?
I think that there's something to that. Yeah, that the influences that we have and like the nudging, that's just like, especially if you spend any time on the internet, like that type of environment is highly manipulative. Like you have to understand manipulation and passive aggressive behavior in order to understand the internet and how it's functioning in an invisible way. There's also direct aggression, but like the more insidious stuff is happening in the background. So I think, you know, it's such a multifaceted thing to get into, because there's also the level of like, what are pro-social behaviors? Well, they're kind of, if you cultivate pro-social behaviors in your personality and turn yourself into somebody that you want to be around and that other people want to be around, you'll probably also solve the dating problem. Like that kind of comes along with the development of a self that where your promises are credible. People can trust you in the future that you're going to do what you say, you know, that you are there for them when they need you. Like all of this stuff is about, are you a credible person in the future? And that is the thing that's breaking down, particularly with optionality.
Now, again, to go all the way back to Harari, the whole point of becoming individuals was so that you wouldn't need your family, so that you wouldn't need another person, so that you could be alone, you could be a rock, you could be an island in the song of Simon and Garfunkel. And it was Thomas Merton wrote that little book, No Man is an Island. This is what we're facing. All the basic questions about what is good, who is good, how can we know the good, and all of this, the individual that we have raised only to find the individual alone and crying out, I don't know what I am, I don't know who I should be, I desperately don't want to be alone. And the stuff, we're drowning in stuff. Stuff doesn't fill me. What will fill me? How can I be filled? So this morning I was finishing up the Rebel Wisdom video, and I couldn't have access to my phone, and so I hadn't on my phone disabled the play next video that the algorithm plays, and it jumped me into this recent Glenn Lowry video, which I thought was incredibly germane to it. Now, here in this video, the question isn't so much, the question isn't dating and sex, it's race.
I've given the title here, Thoughts on the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. I want to begin with a provocative claim. Structural racism, about which we hear so much these days, is an empty category. The phrase is used as both a bluff and a bludgeon. It's a bluff in that it explains nothing while, in effect, daring the listener to notice. For example, when someone says structural racism is the reason why there are so many Blacks in prison, the listener is being dared to reply, no, it's actually because there are so many Black criminals. And it's a bludgeon because its use involves rhetorical intimidation. Having demonstrated no cause and effect processes, it insinuates shadowy causes that are never fully specified. Everybody's just supposed to know that racial disparities are the fault of something called structural racism, abetted by an environment of white privilege, supported by the ultimate bugaboo, white supremacy. George Orwell, the author of the classic 1984, would have seen this way of talking as a version of his newspeak, the use of ambiguous and euphemistic language as a kind of political propaganda. History, I must say, is rather more complicated and more interesting than such just so tales would have it. The outcomes of concern here have multiple interacting causes, but people declaring that structural racism explains racial disparities don't make arguments. Rather, they evince a disposition. They are calling us to solidarity. They're soliciting our fealty. They seek to compel our affirmation of a system of belief. So in this lecture, I'm going to sketch an alternative account of enduring racial disparities. Now, I warn you, I am an economic theorist first and foremost. So my focus here will be conceptual, not empirical. I think we economists need to specify the appropriate model for understanding long enduring racial economic disparities. And so I aim to contribute to that objective in the remarks that follow. As you will see, I do not mince words.
He never does.
Now, why, I want to ask, the success of the civil rights movement notwithstanding, has the unequal economic status of Black Americans persisted into the 21st century? Clear thinking about this difficult problem requires that we distinguish between the role played by anti-Black discrimination, past and present, and the role of behavioral patterns to be found among some Black people. Now, I admit that this puts a very sensitive issue rather starkly. I will be charting a middle course by acknowledging anti-Black biases and insisting they be remedied, but also urging that we also identify the behavioral patterns that prevent some people from seizing newly opened opportunities. In recent writings, I have recast these two positions as causal narratives. The bias narrative argues that the root cause of persisting disparity is found in anti-Black racism. Racial discrimination causes racial inequality, so we have to reform society to achieve a level playing field. It focuses on the demand side of the labor market, for instance. I think such reforms have been necessary, but I think they are not sufficient. The development narrative, by contrast, is concerned with how people acquire skills, traits, habits, and orientations that foster their successful participation in society. Its focus is the supply side of the labor market. Its premise is that those who lack the experiences, who are not exposed to the influences, who do not have access to the resources that foster and facilitate their human development will, in general, fail to achieve their full potential. Of course, these two narratives, the bias narrative and the development narrative, need not be mutually exclusive, but what is clear is that they point in different directions in terms of intervention and remedy. I'm going to be advocating for thinking about this problem through the lens of the development narrative.
Okay, so just so if you haven't understood, he's saying that he wants to look at this at the development narrative. The key thing we want to do is help young Black Americans who especially have not been able to participate in the opportunities that this country has afforded, even many immigrants of various skin colors. Why can't we, what can we do to help young Black Americans in struggling communities and in difficult situations achieve better? And of course, for me, this has been something that it's been a part of my family all of my life.
This tension between a focus on demand side versus supply side factors to account for racial disparities is a very old theme for me. It is what led me to coin the term social capital in my doctoral dissertation back at MIT in the 1970s. In doing so, I was contrasting that concept, social capital, with the more familiar notion to economists, human capital. As you may know, human capital theory studies inequality via a conceptual framework that was initially developed to explain investment decisions by firms, and that focuses on formal economic transactions. I thought that this framework was not adequate when applied to explaining persistent racial economic disparities. I believe my concerns then remain relevant today. And so I'll use my time here to explore these ideas more fully. My basic point in that thesis was that associating business with human investments is merely an analogy, not an identity, particularly when thinking about persistent racial disparities. Business investments are transactional. Human investments are essentially relational.
And that's where I think we need to focus. Human investments are relational. Let's let him talk some more.
So important things were overlooked in the human capital approach, things having to do with informal social relations. Conventional theory, I thought, was incomplete when accounting for racial disparities. And there were two aspects of this incompleteness, which led me to make two observations. One about the dynamics of human development, and the other about the nature of racial identity. I wish to reiterate these observations because they remain relevant today. First, about the dynamics of human development. My first observation was that all human development is socially situated and mediated. The development of human beings occurs inside of social institutions. It is dialogic. It takes place as between people by way of human interaction. The family, the community, the school, the peer group. It is inside these cultural institutions of human association where development is achieved. Resources essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Developmental resources, for the most part, are not commodities. The development of human beings is not up for sale. Rather, networks of connections between people create the context within which developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. People are not machines. Their productivity, that is, the behavioral and cognitive capacities that bear on their social and economic functioning, are not merely the result of some mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities come about largely as the byproducts of social interaction mediated by human affiliation and connectivity. This point was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. That was the first point I was making all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. But my second observation is also important. My second observation was that what we call race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. The persistence across generations of racial differentiation between large groups of people in an open society where people live in close proximity to one another provides irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation in that society. Because there would be no races in the steady state of any dynamical social system unless on a daily basis and in regard to their most intimate affairs, people paid close attention to the boundaries separating themselves from racially distinct others. This is so because over time, race would simply cease to exist unless people were acting so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this second sociological point. We speak casually about racial equality and racial justice, and yet race is not something simply given in nature. Rather, it is socially produced. It is something we are making. That there exist distinct races and is an equilibrium outcome. It's endogenous. It follows that if the goal is to understand the roots of durable racial inequality in any society, we should examine in some detail the processes that cause race to persist as a fact in that society. Almost certainly, such processes will not be unrelated to the allocation among individuals of human developmental resources. So here is my second observation in a nutshell. We economists need to recognize the limits of our tools to account for durable economic disparities by race. The creation and reproduction of such inequality ultimately rest on cultural conceptions that people hold about identity, about the desirability and legitimacy of conducting intimate relations with racially distinct others. And here, I do not only mean sexual relations. Racial inequality is not just a disparity of material resources. Most fundamentally, it is rooted in the decisions that we are all making about with whom to associate and with whom to identify. Such, anyway, was the gist of my argument. The contrast that I drew in my doctoral thesis all those years ago between human and social capital was grounded in my conviction that such decisions determine the access that people enjoy to the informal resources they require to develop their human potential. And so what I was calling social capital when I coined that term in 1976 is, on this view, an essential prerequisite for creating what economists refer to as human capital. As economists, we know that human capital, a person's skills, education, work experience, and social aptitudes, is a key determinant of that person's earnings power and of his or her capacity to generate and to accumulate wealth. Social capital is, in my mind, an extension of human capital theory. The resources people need for their development are not all commodities, as I've said, that can be acquired in markets as a result of transactions. Some of those resources are embedded in a person's social situation. For example, the resource of a mother's attention to her health when a child is in her womb, the resource of peers with whom one associates, and the things they valorize, which then become important things shaping the choices one makes about the acquisition of skills. The resource of information about what is possible to achieve that comes about from one's connection to others who have explored those possibilities. These things are also factors of the production of human skill, or inputs, if you will, into that process of production. But these things are not commodities, as I have said. So a financial deficit does not fully capture a deficit of these things. This was the idea I wanted to employ to give an account of durable racial inequality, even after eliminating most overt market discrimination. I wrote that dissertation in the mid-1970s, just a decade beyond the big civil rights laws, and quite early in this era of relatively fair market opportunities for people, irrespective of race, the era in which we live now. This post-civil rights era is more than a half century old now. I'm not saying that things are perfect in terms of racial equality of treatment, but they are very, very close to being perfect, especially when compared to the historical circumstance. Obviously, there's work to do, but it is a relatively level playing field now in terms of the valuation of skills.
Now, you can listen to the whole thing, obviously, but I thought this key insight about the social capital. I didn't know he coined this term back in the 70s, the social capital that is manifest in each individual. You know, Dune is out right now, and part of what's interesting about Dune is that you have this vision of the Bene Gesserit who are breeding through years and years and years and years to achieve, and now obviously we're not doing that with that kind of you know what I'm saying. But yet, all of how often don't I notice that? It's not the money I can lend a homeless person that is of any worth. It's the relationship. It's the agency that I can lend them. And parents do this for children. It's the, back to, maybe I'll play that clip. It's a great clip.
Jesus seemed to be incarnating as a kairos to change the history of the world and to offer you to change your own personal history is a different kind of love. This is agape. We have to distinguish between three kinds of love: eros, philia, and agape. See, eros is the love that seeks to be one with something. And that can be spiritual, like being one with nature, or it can be being one with a cookie by eating it. Of course, we come to think of eros erotically, right? Being one with somebody by having sex with them. Right? But remember, Socrates knew ta erotica, which wasn't just sex. Socrates knew what to care about. This is philia. So this is the love that is satisfied through consummation. Philia, this is the love that seeks cooperation. This is the love in which we experience reciprocity. We love the cookie because we can consume it. We love our friends because we are in reciprocity with them. What kind of love is this? And this is what Jesus claimed was how God loved individuals. This is the love that a parent has for a child. This is not the love of consummation. You're not trying to consume the child. That's evil. And it's not friendship. You're not, like, when you bring a child home from the hospital, and I've done this twice, right? That's not your friend. It's not even a person. You can't, it's basically a slug. But here's the astonishing thing. You love it. Not because of any way you can consume it or be one with it. Ew. Ew. You don't love it because, hey, what great friendship. You love it, right? You love it because by loving it, you turn a non-person into a person. It's the closest thing to a miracle, and that sounds hackney, I know, but stop back and think about this. You depend on agape. It's because people loved you before you were a person that you have become the person you are. Love turns non-person animals into moral agent persons. It's like somehow if I could just care about, right, my sofa enough, it would turn into a Ferrari or something. It's that powerful. And here's what Jesus was offering. That love can be exacted and made available for all. Here's what is on offer. Here's why Christianity will take the Roman Empire culturally. With agape, Christianity can say to all of the non-persons of the Roman Empire, all the women, all the children, all the non-male citizens, all the sick, all the poor, all the widowed, can take all of those non-persons and say, we will turn you into persons. Persons that belong to the kingdom of God. We'll take another look at this in more detail next time. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Okay, and then I got this video from Job that's in my mind, and so I think it pulls all of this together. This is Jonathan Sachs.
Which I made on the basis of a neuroscientist called Robert Ornstein, who wrote a book called The Right Mind. And this is a very interesting book. It's not the cutting edge latest. It was published in 1998, but very interesting book. And he writes the following. I hope he's right, because I relied on him. That there are two kinds of alphabets. The Hebrew alphabets like Hebrew, well, you don't have any letters for vowels. And alphabets like Greek was the first alphabet that had letters for vowels. And Ornstein makes the following assertion, that any alphabet without vowels is always written from right to left. And every alphabet with vowels is always written from left to right. This is a fascinating discovery. And it is really, really interesting. Why? Because the Greek alphabet is an indirect descendant of this Phoenician script. The first four letters of the Greek alphabet are the first four letters of the Hebrew alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, aleph, beis, gimel, dalet. And it is very interesting that Greek was originally written like Hebrew from right to left. For 1 century, Greek was written in the most curious way imaginable, called boustrophodon, which means as an ox plows a field, right to left, then left to right, then right to left, in a single continuous sort of snakes and ladders kind of thing. It concretizes in the 7th century as left to right. And his theory is very interesting. What's the difference? What happens when you see some letters in Hebrew and then no vowels? How do you know what that word means? The answer is you've got to find out what comes before and what comes after. You've got to see the whole sentence. So you must do an act of integration and contextualization. Whereas if you have the vowels, all you need is that one word, and you know what it means. So his theory is this: if you are reading from right to left, your head is turning towards the left, which means you are engaging the right hemisphere of the brain. Because if you turn left, you know that works transversely, okay? Whereas if you're reading an alphabet with vowels, you're going left to right, so your head is turning right, and you're engaging the left hemisphere of the brain. Now, Ornstein's point, and he's a neuroscientist, he wanted to believe that the left and right hemispheres did the same job, but kept finding again and again and again that they do different jobs. And the left hemisphere of the brain is particularly good at analysis, of breaking things down to its component parts. Whereas the right brain is very good at synthesis, joining things together.
Then, of course, this will continue to be nuanced as we go forward. I mean, we've talked a lot about McGilchrist here.
Which is what you have to do if you want to understand a word in Hebrew. Now, I find this fascinating. Why? Because there's one thing that always puzzled me. I was a philosopher. I was going to say the most useless thing, but then I became a rabbi, so I won't. Maybe they're equally useless. But I mean, the point is this. It's fascinating to me. The rabbis were living. I mean, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were living, I mean, you know, at the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. The rabbis must have known about Greek philosophy, but they didn't do it. How come? They borrowed so much from the Greeks. The word Sanhedrin is Greek. We're going to give our kids and our grandchildren presents when they do the mafia thing of bargaining for the afikomen. That's a Greek word. I mean, the rabbis borrowed ideas from the Greeks, they borrowed words from the Greeks, they borrowed customs from the Greeks, they borrowed argumentative styles from the Greeks. Why didn't they do philosophy? The other thing Greeks did, starting from the 6th century, is they started studying science. Very primitive sort of thing, but at least the beginnings of science and the beginnings of philosophy start in Greece in the 6th century. Now, science and Greek and philosophy are the debts we owe to the Greeks. The rabbis knew this. They coined a blessing. Haro'eh chachmei umot olam. They coined a special blessing for seeing Gentile sages. Now, what did the rabbis coin a blessing for on seeing non-Jewish scholars? What did they think non-Jewish scholars knew that they didn't know? And the answer is science and philosophy. It's that simple, astronomy and so on. So they coined a blessing. They knew this is great knowledge, but it's not us. So why was it that Greece, not Israel, gave rise to science and philosophy, whereas Israel gave birth to religion, to monotheism, to the concepts that eventually, through Christianity and Islam, spread to half the population of the universe? Yet the Greeks never managed it. I wrote a book on religion and science called The Great Partnership, and because it was a very long book, I decided to summarize it in 2 sentences. I couldn't rely on people getting through 120,000 words, so I summarized it in 2 sentences. Here it goes. Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Now, if you take those 2 sentences, you will see that's exactly what you would expect. If Greece is a culture of the left hemisphere of the brain, and Israel a culture of the right hemisphere of the brain, the right hemisphere puts things together to see what they mean, whereas the left hemisphere takes things apart into their atomic parts. And it is fascinating that within 1 century of Greek stabilizing as a left-to-right language, you have, within 1 century, the birth of the 2 supreme left hemisphere activities, philosophy and science, the 2 great analytical things, whereas Jews put things together and so on and so forth. So there is number 2. We developed a particular way of relating to texts, which was different from the Greek way, and putting things together to search not for explanation, but for meaning. And that is the single thing that makes Judaism, the world-transforming force. The fact that Jews were the first people to see meaning in history. As the great Catholic historian Paul Johnson puts on page 2 of his wonderful book, A History of the Jews. Third, I want to end with something very, very striking, which is this. There was an Oxford philosopher called J.L. Austin, who wrote a wonderful book called How to Do Things with Words. Have you come across this book, anyone? Yeah? He calls this performative utterance. So let me give you an example. If I say, we're in the center of the study of Jewish history, that's a description. But if a bridegroom says under a chuppah, Hare at mukudeshet li, he's not describing a marriage, he's getting married. He's doing something with language. When a judge bangs with his gavel and says, this court is now in session, he is actually making that court in session.
He is creating something.
There are rare uses of language where we use language to create a fact. That makes sense to you? How does the Bible begin? How does God create the universe? God speaks. And God said, let there be, and there was. The Torah is telling us something remarkable, that we see language as creative. Language creates the universe. Words create worlds. And when God wants to stop us creating, because he thinks that our creation is a little bit destructive, like the Tower of Babel, what does he do? He confuses language. So when we no longer have language, we can no longer build worlds. Now it was...
Which tells you what a world is. And again, back to the Glenn Lowry, it's the relational, it's the back and forth. This is, and through John Vervaeke, it's the agapic. It's this back and forth, and this is how we knit worlds together. We knit them, and it's upper and lower register, and it's in the process of life, and it's in the process of time.
Nietzsche, I love Nietzsche. I love Richard Dawkins, but my all-time favorite atheist has to be Nietzsche, because he was the only original anti-Semite there has ever been. Everyone else hated Jews because they rejected Christianity. Nietzsche hated Jews because they gave birth to Christianity. This was a very original anti-Semite. But Nietzsche, and not many people have noticed this, wrote a very interesting book called The Genealogy of Morals. And in it he says something very interesting. He says morality is born in the act of promising. And if you think about it, making a promise is the classic example of creating something in language. If I say, I promise I will do something, I have just created something that didn't exist before. I have created an obligation.
Now, this is fascinating because if you go back to Peterson's
mankind was exiled from paradise and began its effortful mortal existence. The idea of sacrifice enters soon afterward, beginning with the account of Cain and Abel and developing through the Abrahamic adventures and the Exodus. After much contemplation, struggling humanity learns that God's favor could be gained and his wrath averted through proper sacrifice, and also that bloody murder might be motivated among those unwilling or unable to succeed in this manner. The delay of gratification. When engaging in sacrifice, our forefathers began to act out what would be considered a proposition if it were stated in words, that something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. Recall, if you will, that the necessity for work is one of the curses placed by God upon Adam and his descendants in consequence of original sin. Adam's waking to the fundamental constraints of his being, his vulnerability, his eventual death, is equivalent to his discovery of the future. The future. That's where you go to die. Hopefully not too soon. Your demise might be staved off through work, through the sacrifice of the now to gain benefit later. It is for this reason, among others, no doubt, that the concept of sacrifice is introduced in the biblical chapter immediately following the drama of the fall. There's little difference between sacrifice and work. They're also both uniquely human. Sometimes animals act as if they're working, but they are really only following the dictates of their nature. Beavers build dams. They do so because they are beavers. Beavers build dams. They don't think, yeah, but I'd rather be on a beach in Mexico with my girlfriend while they're doing it. Prosaically, such sacrifice, work, is delay of gratification, but that's a very mundane phrase to describe something of soul-shattering significance. The discovery that gratification could be delayed was simultaneously the discovery of time, and with it, causality, at least the causal force of voluntary human action. Long ago, in the dim mists of time, we began to realize that reality was structured as if it could be bargained with. We learned that behaving properly now, in the present, regulating our impulses, considering the plight of others, could bring rewards in the future, in a time and place that did not yet exist. We began to inhibit, control, and organize our immediate impulses so that we could stop interfering with other people and our future selves.
Of creating something in language. If I say, I promise I will do something, I have just created something that didn't exist before. I have created an obligation. And in fact, it is only the act of promising that can reconcile freedom and order. If you work this out, you know, the Bible tells us of the world before the flood, which is a world of freedom but complete chaos. And then it tells us the story about Egypt, which is a world of order but no freedom. So the Torah wants to know, how can we avoid the flood on the one hand and slavery in Egypt on the other? How can we have both order and freedom? And it is Nietzsche who tells us that the act of promising creates order and freedom, because when I promise, I am freely undertaking something, but I'm creating order because you can now rely on me to do something in the future. It is Nietzsche who gives us the key to what is the basis of Judaism, shared by no other religion. What do we call a mutual sharing of promises? We call that a brit, a covenant. And that is the basis of Judaism. At Mount Sinai, God makes a promise to the Israelites, "V'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh v'yitem li segula mikol ha'amim." You will be my special people, and Israel promise to keep the word of God, Kol asher yamar Hashem, na'aseh v'nishma. That mutual exchange of promises is using language to create a world. The world of the covenant. The world in which we bind ourselves to God and God binds himself to us. That moment created the whole of Jewish history. Judaism is the world we create with words. And that is why, though every religion has holy places, holy people, and holy times, ours is supremely a religion of holy words. The holiest thing we have is a Sefer Torah, because that is the record of the exchange of promises between God and our ancestors. So, I hope I've shown you 3 ways in which language cuts to the very heart of what it is to be a Jew. Number 1,
and I would say to be human.
Possibility of the alphabet. All our children being able to be literate in our heritage. And that is the basis of a society of equal dignity. Number 2, this extraordinary feature of Hebrew as opposed to Greek. That means it is a language for the right brain. The right brain is not a scientific and philosophical brain. It is a brain that seeks meaning. It tells stories. It builds.
But you Jews have done really well with math and science.
Connections. And that is the great gift Jews gave to the world. And thirdly, the very essence of our relationship with God is on this basis of this exchange of promises, which brings a world into being through words. I hope I've given you something to think about why books are so important to us, and I thank you for being such a good audience.
Back to the original article. But we need to understand that what we're fighting here is not feminism. Again, you can define it any way you want, properly understood, because that's what she wishes not to deconstruct so much. But something I've categorized as bio-libertarianism, a worldview that for 50 years has claimed to act in women's interests, but is increasingly obviously at odds with those interests. It's a worldview that believes human freedom necessitates radical unmooring from the givens of our bodies. We don't quite know how to put this together. We have cads and trads and trad femmes and many more. But I think the rabbi is right. It is in the giving and receiving of promises that, in fact, we relate to God, and that's how men and women relate to each other. And it's upon these things that we, in fact, together build a world that is human, a world we want to live within.